The most powerful being in the entire Marvel universe stood at the center of existence itself, all 6 Infinity Stones glowing in his gauntlet, billions of lives already erased with nothing more than the casual curl of his fingers, every Avenger broken and bleeding at his feet, and not a single force in any known reality capable of stopping him. Until the universe made one mistake, one catastrophic miscalculation, and accidentally pulled in a man from another dimension entirely. A man in a yellow suit and red gloves, a man who had already solved the problem of power so completely that he forgot what the point of fighting even was. Before this story goes any further, you need to understand something. What you are about to watch is not just a fantasy fight. It is the complete, systematic dismantling of everything Thanos believed about power, strength, and the universe itself. And by the time this video ends, you will never look at either of these characters the same way again. So do not touch that skip button, because the moment you think you know where this is going, the story does something you will never see coming. To truly understand what happens when Saitama enters the Marvel Universe, you first have to understand what Thanos had already done before that moment, because the scale of his accomplishment was not just military or political. It was cosmic, it was absolute, and by every measurable standard that any intelligent civilization in any known dimension had ever devised, it was completely and utterly irreversible. Thanos had not always been this figure of unstoppable destruction. There was a time, long before the Gauntlet, long before the Stones, when he was simply a philosopher with a terrible idea. He had looked at his homeworld of Titan, a moon of Saturn that had once been a paradise of advanced civilization, and he had watched it collapse under the weight of its own population, resources drying up, people starving, a society consuming itself from the inside out. And in that devastation, something had crystallized inside him, not grief, not guilt, but a cold and terrifying certainty that the universe itself was broken, that life, left unchecked, would always consume more than existence could provide, and that the only solution was not abundance but reduction. He had proposed this solution to his own people, and they had rejected him, called him mad, exiled him from his dying world, and then watched Titan crumble exactly as he had predicted. That rejection did not humble him. It hardened him into something beyond conviction, something closer to religion. For centuries after that, Thanos had moved through the galaxy like a slow catastrophe, conquering worlds not for empire but for execution, wiping out exactly half of every population he encountered with a mathematical precision that he genuinely believed was mercy. He had armies, he had generals, he had the Black Order, his most devoted and terrifying children, and he had a reputation so profound that entire civilizations had surrendered before he ever arrived, because the alternative was the same outcome with more suffering attached to it. He was not a warlord in the traditional sense. He was something more disturbing than that. He was a true believer, and true believers are always the most dangerous kind of enemy because they cannot be negotiated with, cannot be bribed, and cannot be made to doubt themselves through ordinary means. But even with all of that, even with his armies and his generals and his centuries of conquest, Thanos knew that what he was doing was inefficient. For every world he culled, civilizations would rebuild, populations would recover, the universe would fill itself back in like water rushing into a hole, and he would have to return again, and the cycle would continue forever. What he needed was not a better method but a permanent solution, and that solution had a name, the Infinity Gauntlet. 6 stones, each one a fundamental aspect of reality itself, each one forged from the universe's first moments of existence, and together, combined inside a single glove crafted by the greatest weaponsmith in all of creation, capable of doing with a single gesture what 1,000 armies could not accomplish in 1,000 years. The Mind Stone for control and intellect, the Space Stone for movement without limit, the Reality Stone for bending the physical world to whatever shape he desired, the Power Stone for force so absolute that it could shatter planets without effort, the Time Stone for dominion over the flow of history itself, and the Soul Stone, the most personal and the most terrible of all, which demanded the sacrifice of something loved before it would yield itself to any hand, and which Thanos had paid for with the life of his daughter Gamora, a transaction that had cost him something real and which he had made anyway, because his belief in his mission was stronger than his love. And that, more than anything else, tells you exactly what kind of being Thanos truly was. By the time he had assembled all 6 stones into the completed gauntlet, the Avengers had already fought him across multiple worlds and lost ground at every turn. Thor had come closer than anyone, driving the Stormbreaker axe into Thanos' chest at the moment of apparent victory, close enough that, under any other circumstances, it would have been a killing blow, and Thanos himself had acknowledged it with something almost like respect before reminding Thor that he should have aimed for the head. And then the snap had happened, and half of all life in the universe had simply ceased to exist in the span of a single heartbeat, dissolving into dust and silence, while the remaining half stood in shock so complete that the word grief does not begin to cover it. The Avengers had failed. Not because they were weak or cowardly or unprepared, but because they were facing a being who had planned for every contingency, who had accepted every cost, and who had wielded power so far beyond human scale that their most extraordinary efforts had only barely inconvenienced him. After the snap, Thanos had retreated to a garden planet, a quiet agricultural world where he had destroyed the stones themselves to prevent anyone from using them to reverse what he had done, and he had sat there in the ruins of his purpose, not triumphant exactly, but settled, the way a person feels after completing something enormous and exhausting and final. He had won. The universe had been rebalanced. And for 5 years, the cosmos had adjusted to the new reality, half of everything gone, the survivors living in a world that felt fundamentally wrong in ways that language struggled to capture. What happened next, the time heist, the second gauntlet, Tony Stark's snap, the defeat of the past version Thanos and his army, that was a different chapter entirely, a chapter where human ingenuity and sacrifice had managed to undo the undoable and bring back what was lost. But the Thanos who concerns our story today is not the defeated version from that final battle, and this is where the story pivots into something the Marvel Universe was never designed to handle. Because in the version of events we are exploring right now, something had gone differently at a critical moment. The time heist had succeeded, the stones had been gathered, but before the final confrontation could resolve itself, before any snap could be completed by any hand, a fracture had appeared in the fabric of the multiverse itself. A crack so subtle that none of the instruments the Avengers possessed could detect it, but so consequential that it reached across dimensions and timelines like a fault line running through the foundation of everything. This fracture was not caused by any act of will or any piece of technology. It was simply what happens when beings wield forces that reality was never designed to contain in one place, when the concentration of cosmic power becomes so extreme that the membrane between universes develops a weakness, a thin spot, a place where the boundary between what is and what could be becomes temporarily permeable. And on the other side of that fracture, in a world that operated on entirely different physical laws, where a man had done something so impossible that even the universe of One Punch Man had stopped trying to explain it and simply accepted it as a permanent feature of reality. On that side, a man named Saitama was sitting in his apartment eating a late dinner, watching a home shopping channel because there was genuinely nothing else on, wearing a white tank top and sweatpants, completely unaware that somewhere in the geometry of existence, a doorway had just opened with his name written on it in the language of inevitability. The fracture pulsed once, twice, and then the pull began, not violent, not dramatic, more like the feeling of a drain somewhere beneath everything, drawing together two things that were never meant to occupy the same reality, one because he sought power beyond all limits, and one because he had already found it and was bored out of his mind. The stage was being set for something the Marvel Universe had no category for, no contingency plan for, no infinity stone capable of addressing. Not because the threat was too great, but because the threat was not a threat at all in any conventional sense, and that was exactly what made it so completely, perfectly, and utterly dangerous to everything Thanos had built and believed and sacrificed and become. Two universes were about to share a single point in space and time, and only one of them understood what that meant. To understand why Saitama is so fundamentally different from every other powerful being in any fictional universe ever conceived, you have to start not with his power but with the story of how he got it, because the origin of his strength is simultaneously the most mundane and the most philosophically devastating thing about him. And without that context, he is just a strong guy in a funny costume. But with that context, he becomes something that breaks the very concept of heroism at its foundation. Saitama was not born with power. He was not chosen by prophecy, not bitten by anything radioactive, not forged in the fires of a dying planet, not granted gifts by cosmic entities who saw something special in his bloodline. He was, by every observable measure, an ordinary young man living in an ordinary apartment in City Z, struggling with the same anxieties and frustrations that ordinary people struggle with everywhere. Unemployment, rejection, a growing sense that life was not going anywhere, that the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be was widening rather than closing, and that nobody around him particularly noticed or cared either way. He had tried to get a regular job and failed. He had walked through a world that did not see him as remarkable in any way. And at some point, in the quiet desperation of that invisibility, he had made a decision so simple that it almost seems like a joke when you first hear it, but which turned out to be one of the most consequential training commitments in the history of any universe. He decided to become a hero. Not for fame, not for money, not for recognition or power or the admiration of others. He decided to become a hero because, as he himself would later explain with a casualness that made the statement even more striking, it was something he wanted to do for fun. He wanted to feel the excitement of a real fight, the rush of facing genuine danger, the satisfaction of protecting someone who could not protect themselves. He had that dream clearly in his mind, and he pursued it with a consistency and a dedication that, while completely unglamorous, was absolutely unbreakable. For 3 years, he trained every single day without exception. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run, every day, regardless of weather, regardless of how he felt, regardless of whether anyone was watching or encouraging him or telling him it was worth it. He ate a single banana for breakfast to keep his diet disciplined. He gave up the air conditioning that his tiny apartment barely had anyway. He pushed through exhaustion and soreness, and the complete absence of any visible progress for month after month after month, sustained by nothing except the internal image of himself as a hero, a self-concept so stubbornly maintained that it eventually stopped being aspirational and became simply descriptive. And then something happened that nobody, including Saitama himself, fully understood. His body did not just improve. It transformed beyond any biological framework that medicine or science could map. His hair fell out, all of it, leaving him with the perfectly smooth bald head that would become his most recognizable feature, and in its place came a physical capability so absolute that it no longer existed on the same scale as anyone or anything else in his world. He became strong enough to defeat any opponent with a single punch. Not most opponents, not the ones below a certain power level. Every single opponent, without exception, in a single strike, every single time, and the gap between his power and the power of whatever he was hitting was so enormous that the concept of a close fight had simply ceased to apply to his life. This sounds like the ultimate heroic achievement, and in terms of raw capability, it absolutely was. But here is the part that the story of Saitama spends all of its time exploring, the part that makes him one of the most genuinely interesting characters in modern fiction. The moment he became strong enough to win every fight instantly, the fight stopped meaning anything to him. The excitement he had trained so hard to find, the rush of genuine danger, the satisfaction of a hard-won victory. All of it had evaporated, because you cannot feel the thrill of a battle when you know with absolute certainty before it begins that you will end it with one punch and feel nothing afterward except a vague, hollow disappointment that it was over so quickly. He had solved the problem of power so completely that the solution had destroyed the very thing that had made him want power in the first place. This is what the people who dismiss Saitama as a simple comedy character consistently miss. His tragedy is not that he is weak or unrecognized, though the recognition issue is also real and also painful in its own quieter way. His tragedy is that he achieved his dream completely, and the completion of the dream consumed everything that had made the dream worth having. He had wanted to feel alive through heroism, and his heroism had made him feel less alive than almost anything else in his existence. He went through the motions, registered as a hero with the Hero Association, showed up to fights, defeated catastrophic threats that left the professional heroes in the S-class tier trembling with genuine terror, resolved crises that would have ended cities or entire ecosystems, and then went home to his apartment, checked the sale flyers for the supermarket, worried about whether he had enough money for crab, and watched whatever was on television because there was nothing else that engaged him anymore. The Hero Association itself was a particular kind of indignity in his daily life, because the bureaucratic system that ranked heroes based on examination scores and public approval ratings had placed Saitama in the B class, not because of any accurate assessment of his actual capability, but because he had not scored well on the written portion of the entrance exam and had not yet accumulated the kind of public recognition that pushed heroes into higher classifications. The S-class heroes, beings like Tatsumaki, a telekinetic with power strong enough to lift entire cities, like Bang, a martial arts master whose technique had reached a level that bordered on supernatural, like Genos, a cyborg who had sacrificed his human body for weapon systems of almost incomprehensible lethality. They had reputations, they had histories, they were known and feared and respected throughout the civilization. Saitama had none of that, and the gap between his actual capability and his perceived status was so absurd that it had become almost its own separate joke, except that underneath the joke was something genuinely sad about how the world measures worth. Genos had become his disciple and his roommate, a young man whose entire purpose in life was to find the monster that had destroyed his hometown and kill it, and who had attached himself to Saitama with a devoted sincerity that Saitama found both touching and slightly exhausting. Genos was always taking notes, always analyzing, always trying to isolate the secret of Saitama's power so that he could replicate it. And Saitama's answers to these analytical questions were so simple and so stripped of mysticism. I just trained really hard. I just did the work every day. There is no secret that Genos could never quite accept them, because the answers did not match the scale of the result, and that dissonance followed Genos everywhere. In the world Saitama occupied, threats arrived constantly and at escalating levels of destruction. Monsters would appear, beings of genuinely terrifying power that operated outside human comprehension, that could level cities in minutes, that had no motivation beyond destruction or the satisfaction of dominance. And the Hero Association would mobilize its ranked heroes in response, deploying the appropriate level of force to meet the appropriate level of threat. The system worked reasonably well for threats up to a certain scale. But beyond that scale, beyond the point where even the S-class heroes were struggling and losing and calling for backup that could not arrive fast enough, Saitama would show up, usually late, usually having navigated there by public transit or on foot because he had not budgeted for a taxi, and he would end the entire situation in approximately one punch. And then the cleanup crews would arrive, and the hero rankings would be updated, and everyone would credit the victory to whichever S-class hero had been in the vicinity, because nobody had seen Saitama do anything except stand there looking vaguely dissatisfied. This was his life. This was the rhythm of his existence, Show up, solve the problem, feel nothing, go home. And on the night that the fracture in the multiverse opened, and the pull began reaching across dimensions toward him specifically, Saitama was sitting in exactly the posture you would expect, slouched on his floor cushion, bowl in hand, eyes half-focused on a television program about kitchen utensils, thinking about approximately nothing, experiencing the deep existential flatness that had become his default state, and completely, utterly unprepared for the first fight in a very long time that would make him feel something he had almost forgotten how to recognize. He was about to feel, if not fear, then at least something adjacent to curiosity, and for Saitama, that was almost the same thing. The fracture opened at approximately 2:47 in the morning local time, in the middle of an empty industrial district on the outskirts of City Z, and it opened the way all truly catastrophic things open, quietly, without announcement, without the dramatic buildup that the moment deserved, just a shimmer in the air like heat rising from summer asphalt, and then a tear, a vertical seam in the fabric of space itself. Edges crackling with energy that had no color in the visible spectrum, but which somehow registered to the human eye as deeply, fundamentally wrong. The way a sound that is technically within hearing range can still make every animal instinct in your body want to run without being able to explain exactly why. Thanos stepped through that fracture the way a man steps through a doorway he has used 1,000 times before, with the casual authority of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by the impossible, his massive frame filling the tier almost completely before the dimensional membrane sealed itself behind him with a sound like reality exhaling. He stood in the empty street and looked around with the measured patience of a being who had surveyed 10,000 worlds and knew exactly how to read the geography of a civilization from its architecture alone. The buildings here were different from anything in the Marvel Universe, a specific aesthetic, a particular scale, the evidence of a technological level that was advanced in some directions and oddly modest in others. The air tasted different. The gravitational constant was fractionally different beneath his feet. He was not in his universe anymore, and every instrument in the gauntlet confirmed what his body was already telling him. He had not come here by accident, and he had not come here without purpose. The fracture had been something he had sensed rather than engineered, a vibration in the stones that had drawn his attention the way a musician notices a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise familiar piece. The power stone had flickered with something that was not quite recognition, but was adjacent to it, a resonance with something on the other side of the dimensional boundary that should not have been possible, because the power stone resonated with force, with energy, with raw physical capability, and what it had detected on this side of the fracture was a concentration of that capability so dense and so sourceless that it had registered as an anomaly worth investigating. Thanos investigated anomalies. That was, at its core, what his entire project had always been, the investigation of a universal problem and the application of a solution, and anything that disrupted his understanding of universal constants was by definition relevant to his mission. He activated the space stone first, spreading his awareness outward through the city in a wave of cosmic perception, feeling for the source of what the power stone had detected, moving his consciousness through streets and buildings and sleeping populations until he found it. A small apartment in a residential district several kilometers to the north, an unremarkable structure in an unremarkable neighborhood, and inside it, a single human-shaped presence that radiated the most extraordinary concentration of physical energy he had ever encountered in any universe he had visited, which was a number so large it had stopped being a countable quantity some centuries ago. He walked toward it. He did not teleport, did not fly, did not use the space stone to collapse the distance. He walked, because Thanos had always understood that arrival mattered, that the manner in which you approached something told that something what you thought of it, and the fact that he was willing to walk across a foreign city in the middle of the night to reach a single individual meant that individual had earned a level of consideration that very few things in existence ever received from him. Saitama heard the knock on his door at 2:59 in the morning, and his first thought was that it was Gino's returning from a late maintenance appointment, and his second thought was irritation at the timing, and his third thought, which arrived as he opened the door and looked up at the largest person he had ever seen in his life, was something closer to mild surprise, which for Saitama's emotional range was roughly equivalent to what a normal person would call profound shock. Thanos filled the doorframe completely. The gauntlet on his left hand glowed with the combined light of 6 stones. His expression was the expression of someone conducting a very serious and carefully considered piece of business. Saitama looked at him for a moment, looked at the gauntlet, looked back at his face, and said, with the specific tone of someone who has been interrupted during a television program and is trying to decide how annoyed to be about it, that it was almost 3 in the morning. Thanos studied him in return with the same careful attention he had given the city, reading posture, reading physiological indicators, feeling the energy that the Power Stone was practically vibrating in response to, and said that he had come to understand what Saitama was, because the universe did not produce concentrations of power like this without reason, and he needed to know if that reason was compatible with his own purpose or contrary to it. Saitama considered this for approximately 2 seconds, decided that whatever this was qualified as a monster encounter, and stepped out into the hallway because he did not want any damage to his apartment, which was a priority that tells you everything you need to know about where he was in his emotional relationship with heroism at this particular moment in his life. They moved to the street outside, and then Thanos did something that he had not done in a very long time. He tested his opponent before engaging fully, sending a probe of Power Stone energy outward in a focused pulse, not a lethal strike but a measure, the cosmic equivalent of a physician tapping a knee to test reflexes, watching for the response. The pulse hit Saitama, and Saitama stood there, hands in the pockets of his sweatpants, and did not move, because the pulse had not moved him, and he was waiting to see where this was going with the patient boredom of someone who has been through this particular opening sequence many times before. Thanos felt something shift in his assessment. He escalated. The Power Stone came fully online, and he directed a column of energy at Saitama that would have disintegrated a mountain range, a strike of sufficient force to crack the surface of a planet, compressed and focused and aimed at a single bald man standing on a residential street at 3 in the morning. The energy column hit Saitama and pushed him back approximately 1 step. His sweatpants were slightly singed. He looked down at them with an expression of mild annoyance, looked back up at Thanos, and said that those were relatively new. What Thanos experienced in that moment was not fear. Fear was not an emotion that his psychology had much room for anymore, but something that functioned like recalibration, a rapid and urgent reprocessing of every assumption he had made about the nature and limits of what he was dealing with. In his experience, the Power Stone at full output was an argument that ended arguments, a physical fact so overwhelming that nothing biological or technological in any universe he had visited could stand against it without being erased. And yet the thing standing in front of him was not erased, was not damaged in any meaningful way, was mildly annoyed about its pants, and was waiting with the posture of someone who had somewhere else they would rather be. He reached for the reality stone next, because if raw power was not sufficient, then perhaps the alteration of the physical laws governing Saitama's body would produce a different result. He rewrote the local reality to remove Saitama's skeletal structure, to replace the air around him with a substance that should have been impossible to breathe, to alter the gravitational constant around his body to several hundred times Earth normal. Stacking physical modifications on top of each other with the practiced efficiency of someone who had used this stone to dismantle entire ecosystems. Saitama's skeleton disappeared, and then reappeared because his body simply refused to acknowledge the change. The unbreathable air around him dispersed because his respiratory system treated it as a minor inconvenience. The crushing gravity pressed down on him, and he stood under it the way a building foundation stands under the weight of the structure above it, not straining, not struggling, simply there, existing in defiance of the conditions being imposed on it, because the conditions being imposed on it were operating on a scale that his body had stopped recognizing as relevant somewhere around the end of his first year of training. He looked up at Thanos with an expression that was the closest thing to interest he had shown since the encounter began, and said that those were some pretty good tricks. Thanos looked back at him across the small distance of the residential street, the gauntlet still fully powered, 5 stones having now produced essentially no meaningful result against a target who was offering the considered opinion that they were decent tricks. And for the first time since Titan, since the moment he had proposed his solution and been rejected and watched his world die, something inside the architecture of his certainty developed a hairline fracture. He had found something he did not have a category for, and Thanos, who had built his entire identity on having a category for everything, did not know yet what that meant, but some deep and ancient instinct that predated his philosophy and his mission, and his decades of cosmic conquest was telling him, very quietly and very clearly, that he should find out before he went any further. He chose instead to go further. There is a particular kind of desperation that only the truly powerful ever experience, and it is nothing like the desperation of ordinary people, because ordinary desperation comes from having too little time, too little money, too little strength, too little of whatever resource the situation demands. But the desperation of the powerful comes from the opposite direction entirely, from having deployed everything you possess and discovering that everything you possess is not enough. And that discovery, for someone who has built their entire identity on the sufficiency of their power, does not arrive as fear so much as it arrives as a fundamental identity crisis, wearing the mask of urgency. This was the desperation that began settling into Thanos as the encounter in that residential street continued past every threshold he had previously understood as decisive, and it changed him in ways that the Avengers, for all their intimate knowledge of his brutality, had never actually witnessed, because the Avengers had never managed to push him to this place. He began with the Mind Stone, because the Mind Stone operated on a level that bypassed physical resistance entirely, reaching not into the body but into the consciousness, the seat of will and perception and selfhood, the place where even the most physically indestructible being was theoretically vulnerable because identity itself is a fragile construction dependent on continuous psychological coherence. He directed the Mind Stone's energy into Saitama with surgical precision, aiming not to damage but to dominate, to reach into the structure of his awareness and rewrite the instructions his mind was giving his body, to make him believe he was falling when he was standing, to make him feel pain that his nerves were not actually generating, to flood his perceptual reality with sensory information that had no physical source and which should have been indistinguishable from actual experience, because the Mind Stone did not simulate neurological events. It produced them directly at the source. Saitama blinked. He tilted his head slightly to the left in the manner of someone who has heard an unexpected sound and is trying to locate its origin. Then the expression cleared, and he looked back at Thanos with the same mild attentiveness he had been maintaining since the beginning of the encounter, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about an experience that had lasted approximately 1.5 seconds before his mind had simply declined to continue engaging with it, not through any act of will or resistance or psychological training, but because the architecture of his consciousness had been so thoroughly restructured by 3 years of training that the ordinary leverage points the Mind Stone relied upon, self-doubt, fear, the gap between what a being believed about itself and what was actually true, simply did not exist in him anymore. Saitama did not doubt his strength. He was not afraid of pain. There was no gap between his self-concept and his reality, because his reality had long since exceeded every self-concept he had ever attempted to construct. The Mind Stone reached into him looking for a weakness, and found a space so thoroughly cleared of the usual psychological furniture that it had nothing to grip. Thanos withdrew the Mind Stone's influence and stood very still for a moment in the way that people stand still when they are doing rapid and serious internal calculation. And then he did something that represented a genuine strategic shift rather than just an escalation of force. He activated all 6 stones simultaneously, not in sequence, not targeting specific vulnerabilities, but in concert, weaving their individual capabilities into a unified field that operated on every level of physical and metaphysical reality at once, which was the gauntlet at its absolute theoretical maximum, the thing that had allowed him to reshape the universe with a single gesture, the thing that no being in the Marvel Universe had been able to withstand or reverse without extraordinary sacrifice and equally extraordinary ingenuity. The field expanded outward from the gauntlet in a wave that rewrote local spacetime around Saitama completely, simultaneously removing him from the physical timeline so that he existed in a bubble of temporal stasis, replacing the reality he occupied with one in which his body followed different physical laws, flooding that altered reality with power stone energy sufficient to collapse a star, directing the Soul Stone's influence at the fundamental animating principle of his existence, and running the Mind Stone's full output as a continuous override of every neurological process his body was attempting to execute. It was, by any objective measure, the most comprehensively overwhelming application of cosmic force ever directed at a single biological target in the history of that gauntlet's use. Saitama sneezed. It was not a metaphorical sneeze or a symbolic one. The change in atmospheric composition created by the reality stone's alterations introduced a particulate into the air that irritated his nasal passages, and he sneezed the way any person sneezes when something goes up their nose unexpectedly, reaching up to cover his face with the back of his hand in the automatic gesture of someone who was raised to be polite about it. He then looked up at Thanos, sniffed once, and said that something in whatever that was had gotten into his nose. The 6-stone field collapsed, not because Thanos released it. He did not release it. He was still pouring everything he had into the gauntlet, but because the field had encountered a target that its operating assumptions were not built to address, and those assumptions had failed at the foundational level. The stones worked by operating on the fabric of reality, by manipulating the rules that governed all physical and metaphysical existence, but those rules had never been designed with Saitama's specific situation in mind, because Saitama's situation was not a product of cosmic engineering or divine intervention or the manipulation of fundamental forces. It was a product of 3 years of push-ups. And the universe had no framework for quantifying what 3 years of push-ups looked like when performed with that particular quality of commitment, because nobody had ever done them before, and nobody had thought to write the rule. Thanos lowered the gauntlet slowly, and in the quiet of that residential street at something past 3 in the morning, with the stones still glowing against the dark and Saitama standing in his singed sweatpants with an expression of moderate interest, the Mad Titan did something that perhaps 5 beings in the history of the universe had ever witnessed him do. He thought. Not tactically, not strategically, but fundamentally, reaching down into the philosophical bedrock of everything he believed and examining it with the same cold honesty he had applied to Titan's collapse all those centuries ago, asking himself the question that his entire project had been built on avoiding. What do you do when the framework that justifies everything you have done turns out to be incomplete? Because his framework was built on the premise that resources were finite, that power had limits, that the universe operated within constraints that made his solution not just reasonable but necessary. And standing in front of him was a living refutation of every limit he had ever calculated, a being whose power had no ceiling he could detect, no source he could identify, no mechanism he could interrupt, and who was bothered by it approximately as much as a person is bothered by mild seasonal allergies. If power like this was possible, if a single individual could exist at this scale through nothing more than disciplined physical training, then his entire mathematics of scarcity was not just wrong but meaninglessly wrong, built on a sample size that had not included the most important data point. But Thanos was not built for the kind of humility that leads to abandonment of a purpose. He was built for the kind of resolve that finds a new path toward the same destination, and the new path his mind arrived at in those few seconds of genuine stillness was not retreat and not negotiation, but something more dangerous than either. It was the decision to stop fighting Saitama with the gauntlet and start fighting him with something that the gauntlet could not provide and Saitama's physical invulnerability could not deflect, which was the particular weapon that Thanos had always been most skilled with, more skilled than any stone or any army had ever made him. The weapon of absolute and unshakable conviction deployed at the level of argument rather than force. He straightened to his full height, let the gauntlet's glow dim to a steady idle, looked at Saitama with an expression that had shifted from tactical assessment to something more like the way a philosopher looks at an audience he is about to address, and said that he had not come to this world to fight him. He had come because the Power Stone had detected something that changed the calculation, and now that he had confirmed what that something was, he wanted to talk, because in his experience the beings most worth talking to were the ones whose power made conversation optional rather than mandatory, the ones who could choose to listen rather than having listening forced upon them. Saitama looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at the sky beginning to lighten slightly at the eastern edge of the city, and then looked back at Thanos, and said that he had nothing to do until the supermarket opened anyway. And that was how the most dangerous conversation in the history of two universes began, on a sidewalk in City Z, between a purple cosmic warlord with a magic glove and a bald man in singed sweatpants, while the birds started their early morning routines in the trees overhead, and the first delivery trucks of the day began making their rounds through the surrounding streets. The conversation lasted until sunrise, and it was not the kind of conversation that either of them had expected when it began, because Thanos had expected to find an audience for his philosophy, and instead found something considerably more unsettling, which was a listener who understood the argument completely and was not impressed by it. And Saitama had expected to spend 20 minutes humoring a very large and unusually well-accessorized monster before going back to bed, and instead found himself engaged in the first exchange of ideas that had genuinely held his attention in longer than he could accurately remember, because Thanos was, whatever else he was, one of the most intelligent and most thoroughly considered minds that any universe had ever produced, and even a wrong argument, when constructed by a truly exceptional intelligence, has a texture and a density that makes it worth following to its conclusion. Thanos had laid out his case with the clarity and the precision that centuries of conviction produce, explaining the mathematics of resource consumption and population growth, the thermodynamic reality of a finite universe being asked to support infinite expansion. The compassion that he believed was embedded in his solution, even though its surface appearance was indistinguishable from atrocity, and the personal cost he had paid Gamora, always Gamora. The price that the Soul Stone had extracted, and that he carried with him in the specific way that only genuine grief is carried, not displayed but present. The way a healed fracture is present in a bone even when it is no longer visible from the outside. He was not performing his philosophy for Saitama. He was explaining it, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference was perceptible even to someone whose engagement with abstract ideas was as uncomplicated as Saitama's tended to be. Saitama had listened to all of it, sitting on the curb with his elbows on his knees, and when Thanos finished, he had been quiet for a moment, and then said something that Thanos had not anticipated, which was that the problem with the math was that it assumed the people being erased were the variable and the resources were the constant. But if you could make the resources the variable instead, the whole equation changed, and you would not need to erase anyone. Thanos had looked at him with an expression that contained something that might have been genuine surprise, and said that was exactly the counterargument his people on Titan had offered, and that it had not saved them, because the resource expansion they had proposed had arrived too late and been insufficient to the scale of the crisis, and the population had collapsed anyway. And Saitama had said that the difference between Titan's failure and a real solution was probably not the math but the timeline, and that most problems that looked like they required permanent solutions actually required patient ones, which was something he had learned not from philosophy, but from 3 years of doing the same exercises every morning while nothing visibly changed, and then one day everything had changed all at once. Thanos had gone very quiet after that, and in the silence something had shifted between them that was not warmth exactly, but was the specific atmospheric change that happens when two people have been adversaries, and then find the edge of a genuine point of contact, a place where their experiences, however different in every surface detail, have produced a similar understanding about the nature of commitment and cost, and the particular loneliness of pursuing something that nobody around you can fully see or share. They had both paid enormous prices for the things they believed in. The difference was that one of them had paid those prices in the currency of others' lives, and the other had paid them entirely in his own, and that difference was not small, but it was also not the totality of what they were to each other in that moment. And then the alert had come through on Saitama's phone, a Hero Association emergency notification, the kind that carried the highest priority classification, the kind that was sent when a threat had been assessed as existential rather than merely catastrophic, the kind that Saitama received with a frequency that had long since stripped it of any emotional urgency, but which he still responded to because responding to it was what heroes did, and he was, despite everything, still committed to being one. He had looked at the notification, looked at Thanos, and said that he had to go deal with something, and that Thanos should stay where he was. Thanos had not stayed where he was. He had followed, because the conversation was not finished, and because the being he had been unable to affect with the completed Infinity Gauntlet was now walking toward a threat that had been classified as existential, and he was curious, in the way that only someone who has been genuinely surprised can be curious, to see what that looked like from the outside. What it looked like from the outside was this. A creature had emerged from the ocean approximately 40 kilometers south of City Z, a dragon-level threat in the Hero Association's classification system, which was the highest category on their scale, reserved for entities capable of destroying entire cities or potentially wiping out human civilization entirely if left unaddressed. It stood at approximately 300 meters tall, a mass of biological horror that had evolved or been created, or had simply spontaneously manifested in the deep ocean trenches, where the pressure and the darkness produced things that the surface world had no evolutionary preparation for encountering. The S-class heroes who had been dispatched to address it were doing their best, which was genuinely impressive, because S-class heroes were not ordinary beings. Their best represented the absolute ceiling of what human or human-adjacent capability could achieve, and their best was producing results that could most charitably be described as slowing the thing down while sustaining injuries that would require months of recovery. Saitama arrived, assessed the situation with the practiced efficiency of someone who has processed this particular type of scenario several hundred times, confirmed that the civilians in the surrounding area had been evacuated, waited for the S-class heroes to clear the immediate vicinity of the target because he did not want to accidentally include them in the resolution, and then hit the creature once. The punch landed in the center of the creature's mass, and the shockwave it produced traveled outward in a perfect sphere, flattening the ocean surface for 2 kilometers in every direction, generating a sound that registered on seismic equipment as far away as 3 countries, and reducing the dragon-level threat to a dispersing cloud of biological material that rained down on the ocean surface for the next several minutes like a very unpleasant weather event. The whole process, from his arrival to the complete elimination of the threat, had taken approximately 45 seconds, and at least 30 of those seconds had been spent waiting for the S-class heroes to get clear. Thanos had watched all of this from an elevated position on the coastal cliffs, the gauntlet completely still at his side, the stones quiet, and what he experienced watching Saitama eliminate a creature that would have required the full combined deployment of his most elite military assets to address was not quite awe. He had seen extraordinary things. He was not easily awed, but something more specific and more personal, which was recognition. He recognized what he was looking at because he had spent centuries trying to achieve something similar, trying to become the being whose single decisive action resolved the problem that no accumulation of lesser actions could resolve, trying to reach the level of power where the gap between intention and outcome collapsed to nothing, where will and result were the same thing with no distance between them. He had believed the gauntlet was that thing. He had built his entire final chapter on the premise that with the completed gauntlet, he was that being. Watching Saitama walk back across the water toward the shore, hands in his pockets, the destroyed creature still settling into the ocean behind him, Thanos understood with a clarity that was almost physical that he had not been that being, had never been that being, and that the gauntlet had been a prosthetic for a power he did not possess rather than an amplification of a power he did. And the difference between those two things was exactly the difference between himself and the bald man, currently climbing back up the coastal rocks, with the mild expression of someone who had completed a minor errand and was thinking about what to have for breakfast. He had come to this universe looking for an anomaly. He had found the answer to a question he had not known he was asking, which was what it actually looked like when the problem of power was genuinely solved rather than merely approximated. And the answer was not a glowing gauntlet, and it was not a philosophy, and it was not the sacrifice of everyone and everything he had ever cared about. The answer was a bald man in singed sweatpants who had done push-ups every morning for 3 years because he wanted to feel something, and who now felt nothing because he had achieved everything, and who helped people anyway because that was what you did when you had the capability to help and someone needed it, not because it was meaningful or exciting or because anyone was watching, but simply because the alternative was going home and watching television. And on balance, this was slightly better than that. Saitama climbed back to the top of the cliff, noticed Thanos standing there, and said that he was going to the supermarket now because it had just opened, and they had a sale on crab that ended at noon. Thanos stood very still for a moment, 6 infinity stones silent on his hand, the weight of centuries of conviction pressing down on him from the inside. And then he said, quietly enough that the words were almost lost in the sound of the ocean below them, that he had made a mistake that could not be corrected, and he needed to think about what came next. Saitama looked at him with the specific expression he reserved for things that were not his problem, but which he was going to acknowledge anyway out of basic decency, and said that thinking was probably a good place to start, and that the supermarket also had a decent ready-made meal section if Thanos was hungry, because, in his experience, most decisions made on an empty stomach were worse than the same decisions made after eating. And this seemed like the kind of decision that deserved the best possible conditions. And then he walked toward the supermarket, and after a moment, because he had nowhere else to be and nothing left that he was certain of, Thanos followed him, the most powerful weapon in the history of the Marvel Universe hanging quietly at his side, its stones dimmed to almost nothing, carrying a being who had just lost the argument he had spent his entire existence winning, to a supermarket in a city he had never heard of. To think about what you do when everything you knew turns out to have been a very costly, very committed, very sincere approximation of the truth. The supermarket was quiet at that hour. The way supermarkets are quiet in the earliest part of the morning when the shelves have just been restocked, and the fluorescent lights hum with a particular frequency that makes everything feel simultaneously mundane and slightly unreal. And the few other shoppers moving through the aisles at that hour gave Thanos the wide berth that any reasonable person gives to a 7-foot purple individual carrying what appears to be a large glowing glove. Because City Z had learned through long and painful experience that the correct response to things you did not understand was to give them space and let the heroes handle it. And while Saitama did not look like what most people expected a hero to look like, he was recognizable enough to the regular early morning shoppers in this particular supermarket that his presence alongside the large purple individual was interpreted as a situation being managed rather than a situation requiring additional alarm. Saitama found his crab. It was on sale, as advertised, and he put it in his basket with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose morning has delivered on at least one of its promises, and then moved through the rest of the aisles with the focused efficiency of a person who shops with a mental list rather than a written one, and has been doing it long enough that the layout of the store is as familiar as the layout of his own apartment. Thanos followed at a slight distance, not browsing, not engaging with the environment, but thinking in the deep and thorough way that his mind worked when it was processing something genuinely new, turning the morning's events over and examining them from different angles the way a craftsman examines a piece of work for flaws. Except that the piece of work in this case was the entire philosophical structure he had spent centuries building, and the flaw he was looking for was the one that had led him to a residential street in a foreign universe at 3 in the morning, deploying the most powerful weapon in existence against a man who had been more concerned about his sweatpants. What Thanos arrived at, standing in the canned goods aisle of a supermarket in City Z, while Saitama compared 2 different brands of instant noodles with the serious attention that the decision genuinely deserved, was not a simple conclusion but a layered one, the kind that arrives not as a single thought, but as a series of connected realizations that each make the previous one more significant in retrospect. The first layer was the one he had already acknowledged on the cliff, that the gauntlet had been a prosthetic rather than a genuine expression of power, that he had been compensating for an absence rather than extending a presence. The second layer, which arrived quietly behind the first, was that his diagnosis of the universe's problem had been correct in its identification of the symptom and catastrophically wrong in its identification of the cure. Because the symptom was real, resources were finite, populations did grow, civilizations did collapse under their own weight, but the cure had been wrong not because it was too extreme, but because it was too small. Addressing the symptom at the level of individual lives rather than at the level of the systemic conditions that produced the symptom, which was exactly the error that Saitama had identified on the curb at sunrise, when he said the problem was treating people as the variable instead of the resources. The third layer was the one that cost him the most to reach, because it required him to look directly at Gamora, to hold her in his mind not as a sacrifice that had purchased something necessary, but as a sacrifice that had purchased something wrong, which meant her death had not been the hard price of a correct solution, but simply a loss, unadorned by purpose, not redeemable by any subsequent action, because the action it had purchased was an error from the beginning. He stood very still in the canned goods aisle for a long moment, and the stones in the gauntlet flickered once with something that had no tactical interpretation, and then he was moving again, because stillness in the face of that particular realization was not something his psychology was equipped to sustain for very long. He found Saitama at the checkout, paying for his crab and his noodles and a bag of chips that had been on sale near the register, in a placement that Saitama recognized as a commercial manipulation, and bought anyway because they were the flavor he liked. And he said to Saitama, with the directness of someone who does not have the patience for conversational approaches to important subjects, that he needed to return to his universe and undo what he had done. not through any new deployment of force, but through the reversal mechanism that the Avengers had already demonstrated was possible, and that he needed to do it without the certainty he had always carried before, which meant doing it as an act of correction rather than an act of mission, which was a different thing entirely and considerably harder, psychologically, than anything the Gauntlet had ever asked of him physically. Saitama picked up his bag, received his change, thanked the cashier with the automatic politeness of someone who does it genuinely rather than performatively, and walked toward the exit, and said to Thanos as he pushed through the door into the morning that it sounded like Thanos actually had something worth doing now, which was more than a lot of people could say, and that, in his experience, having something worth doing was not the same as enjoying it, but it was better than the alternative. And the alternative was sitting in your apartment watching home shopping channels and feeling nothing, which was a condition he was familiar with and did not recommend. Thanos looked at him for a moment, standing in the supermarket doorway with the morning light coming in around him, and said that Saitama's training had cost him his ability to feel the thing he had trained to feel, and asked if he considered that a fair trade. And Saitama was quiet for long enough that the question seemed to have landed somewhere real, somewhere beneath the habitual blankness that covered whatever was actually happening in his emotional interior. And then he said that he did not know yet, and that not knowing was something he was still getting used to, but that he showed up anyway, every day, because the people he protected did not need him to feel anything. They needed him to be there. And being there was something he could still do regardless of what he felt or did not feel about doing it, and that on most days that was enough, and on the days it was not enough, it was still what he did. The fracture reopened at the edge of the industrial district, sensing the presence of the Gauntlet and responding to it, the way dimensional membranes respond to the energies that created them, pulling apart along the original seam with the same quiet wrongness it had displayed on arrival. And Thanos stood before it with the Gauntlet held slightly away from his body, in the manner of someone carrying something heavy that they are finally ready to put down. He turned once to look back at Saitama, who had followed him to the district not because he was escorting him or ensuring his departure, but simply because the walk was in roughly the direction of his apartment, and he had finished his shopping and had nothing else that needed doing before lunch. And here is where the story does the thing you were not expecting, the thing that reframes everything that came before it, and makes the encounter mean something different than the spectacle of power it appeared to be on its surface. Because as Thanos turned to step back through the fracture, the time stone on the Gauntlet pulsed once, independently without his direction, and in that pulse it showed him something, not a vision of the future. The time stone did not work that way in this context, but a reflection of the present, a clear and unmediated image of what the current moment actually was, stripped of every layer of narrative and philosophy and history that he had draped over it. And what it showed him was this: a being of incomprehensible power, standing in an industrial district in a foreign universe with a bag of groceries, who had chosen, every single morning for 3 years and every single morning since, to do something that cost him everything and gave him back almost nothing, not because it was glorious or because it was recognized or because it resolved the deep existential flatness that had settled into him when his dream completed itself ahead of his ability to adjust to it, but because it was the right thing to do, which was the simplest reason and the hardest one to sustain, and which required no gauntlet and no philosophy and no cosmic justification, only the decision, made fresh every morning, to show up. Thanos stepped through the fracture, and it sealed behind him, and the industrial district was quiet again in the way it had been quiet before he arrived, except that the air still carried the faint residual energy signature of 6 Infinity Stones, and the asphalt at the point of entry and exit was slightly discolored in a pattern that would confuse structural engineers for several years before being attributed to an unusual mineral deposit. Saitama walked home. He put the crab in the refrigerator for dinner. He sat down on his floor cushion. The television was still on the home shopping channel from the night before. A different host now, but the same unbroken stream of products being enthusiastically described to an audience of early risers. And he watched it for a while without really watching it. And then he picked up his phone and looked at the Hero Association app. And there was a new alert, a demon-level threat in the commercial district. And he put the phone in his pocket and stood up and went to deal with it. Not because he was excited. Not because it would mean anything or resolve anything or fill the particular hollow space that 3 years of push-ups had created where his sense of challenge used to live, but because someone needed him to be there, and he could be there, and that, on this morning as on every other morning, was the whole of the reason and the whole of the story. In the Marvel Universe, 3 weeks later, the Avengers detected an anomaly in the space where the Infinity Stones had been destroyed. A faint but unmistakable resonance suggesting that the destruction had been incomplete, that some fundamental aspect of the stones persisted beyond their physical form, which was a discovery that opened questions nobody was fully prepared to answer, and which set in motion a chain of events that would occupy them for a considerable time to come. Tony Stark, reviewing the resonance data in his lab late one night, noted in his private log that the energy signature reminded him of something biological rather than something cosmic, that it had the quality of a living thing rather than a dead one, and that whatever Thanos had experienced in the weeks before his return had changed the character of the stones in ways that the existing theoretical frameworks were not equipped to explain. And that understanding those changes was probably the most important scientific problem currently in existence, and that he was going to need more coffee. And somewhere in the deep geometry between universes, in the space between what is and what could be, the fracture that had opened and closed twice in a single night left a scar in the dimensional membrane that would never fully heal, a permanent thin spot in the boundary between two realities, and through that thin spot, in the right conditions, under the right atmospheric and energetic circumstances, it was theoretically possible to hear, very faintly, the sound of someone doing push-ups, counting quietly to themselves, somewhere on the other side of everything. 1, 2, 3, 4, 100. Every morning, without exception. Because that was what you did when you had made a promise to yourself, even if the promise had cost you more than you knew you were agreeing to pay, and even if nobody was watching, and even if it no longer felt like anything at all. You showed up. That was the whole secret. That was the only punch that ever actually mattered.